Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this DAP learning series, and really excited for this particular topic. It's called Shifting Your Metrics Mindset, and we'll be discussing how to move from relying too heavily on metrics that are pushed on us by sort of marketing and industry, and how to think more in a mindset of the best way to efficiently analyze content, especially in the lens of government websites, because we have a lot of content. So my name is Tim Loudon. I'm the manager of the Digital Analytics program. I'm joined today by my colleague, the incomparable Freddie Blicker, who will be helping out in the Q&A section, reading the questions that you ask, and also by our DigitalGov University team, Alex and Alex. And couple things to start with before we actually get started with the content. Firstly, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Secondly, if you need to leave before we're done, have no fear. This session is being recorded, and we'll have it posted in the next couple days on our YouTube Analytics playlist, which the link will come out to you in the follow-up email. Thirdly, the slides, I am going to endeavor to send them out to you before close of business today, hopefully. And they have some links in there that hopefully will prove helpful for you. So you'll get the slides as well. And finally, as always, we have a satisfaction survey that we'll be putting in the chat towards the end of the session, and also will be coming to you in the follow-up. And if you could please fill out that survey, it does help us a lot so that we can frame these in a way that's most beneficial for you all. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and get started. Oh, if I can get my slides to advance, we can get started. So let's talk about the agenda for today. Firstly, we're going to be discussing the problem with what I call the page views paradigm and other metrics the private sector tells you are important. Secondly, we'll be considering how you think about metrics to measure success in the public sector, and that for the most part is talking about content. Thirdly, we'll offer some practical measures for real impact on government sites. And finally, we'll go through Q&A. So it's pretty straightforward. I am not a designer, so please excuse the amateur nature of the design in the slides in this presentation. They're amateur looking because I'm an amateur. So I do web analytics, not so much design. So let's talk about the problem with the page views paradigm and the metrics the private sector tries to tell you are the most important. So the first question I want to ask is, why do page views as a metric reign supreme? Page views are obviously the thing that people, focus on the most when talking about web analytics. The first thing people care about with web analytics is page views. Or even, I've said this in some of my other trainings before, in some cases, they'll use the term hit, right? How many hits does this page or does this site get? And I think particularly within the lens of working in government, or if you work on a content-based website, that is problematic. And so I have here a screenshot from a blog post that I found, in the links on the bottom. And I want you to kind of look at this a little bit. And it says, number one, step one, identify what you have to offer. How much traffic do you need to sell advertising on your site? And this particular blog says, you'd shoot for 50,000 page views before looking to sell ads. And the second paragraph, when we first started selling direct ads last year, we saw about 90,000 unique visitors monthly, 165,000 page views. And then see at that next sentence, at first, we promised advertisers 35,000 impressions, parentheses, that's ad speak for page views each month. But later we increased the 50,000 impressions to ensure they got enough clicks to make their ad worthwhile. So that's a little bit of a case study from some person who runs a blog and they sell ads. And you could see here, they were talking about this impressions. And I love how this person actually said that's ad speak for page views, because basically what those impressions are is how many times does the ad appear? And there's an algorithm that makes it so that every X amount of page views, the ad pops up, they get 35,000 impressions. You talk about things like click-through rate and so on and so on. Speaking of click-through rate, here's from another blog, how much do websites make from ads? And this person in this blog, if you click on the link and you go there, They talk about, you know, the click-through rate and cost per click and all these things that really most of us on this call don't have to care about. And you can see here in the monthly page views, as you go up, assuming a click-through rate of 0.44%, if you get to 1 million page views, you're making $2,500 a month. So why do page views reign supreme? Well, if you haven't figured that out yet, it's because of money. Page views, the bigger the amount of page views, the more ads you can sell. And the reason that's problematic is because most of us in government aren't trying to sell ads on our website. In fact, I would venture to say almost none of us are trying to sell ads on our website. We might have ads to try to promote our website, but we're not trying to sell ads. So this is an issue. And the problem with this is that because page views are so popular as the golden metric to look at, because everyone thinks that traffic is a determinant of success, that it's being forced upon us throughout the entire industry. Right? We know whether you be selling e-commerce or whether you be a government site trying to get content out, like in some cases, very valuable, critical content to people, especially obviously we've had the example recently of COVID-19, where these agencies are trying to get content out, and like, yes, page views are important, but not as important as everyone tries to tell us. So I have two examples here, and I'm gonna open up the pages so we can look at them a little bit. But my two examples are, one of them is an institute in the National Institutes of Health. It's the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research. So as you can tell, that's a very sort of niche area. The other one is travel.state.gov, which varies quite a bit from the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research. So let's talk about these two examples. I have on the NIDCR page here, I navigated, the link goes directly to a specific section about grants and funding, and I'm going to talk mostly about this page today. And you can see here, so we've got grants and funding, and we're looking at oral and salivary cancer biology program, and there are funding opportunity announcements to get grant funding to try to do research on oral and salivary cancer, right? So that's our first example that I want everyone just to remember what we're looking at here, and we'll talk about it in a moment. Now, conversely, my other example is travel.state.gov, and that's where you would go to find, for example, travel advisories, various other aspects. But one of the big things that travel.state.gov handles are passports. And if you want to renew your passport, they have this page here where it gives you instructions on how to renew your passport. And you can go through steps 1 through 7, and it's got FAQs and all these things. And that's what we're going to talk about here. So now that we've seen these examples, let's talk about how they're different. So firstly, NIDCR. Very, very small target audience. We're talking about not only people who are interested in dental and craniofacial research, but even more specifically, that particular page I was on was about oral and salivary cancer biology research grants. So the folks at NIDCR, and I picked this totally at random. I don't know if we have any NIH folks on this call right now. So if you are, I apologize for using you as an example. But the folks at NIDCR really don't have to care about page views in a way where they would say compare themselves to travel.state.gov or compare themselves to, you know, cdc.gov, for example, even in the health field. They have a very different target audience and therefore very different goals. So only a few qualified people need to see it in order for it to be successful. And, you know, this example in particular, if we were to follow it as far as we could, you would need a qualified person who's interested in this specific category of research to apply for the grant. And then if they're awarded the grant and they make some incredible medical breakthrough on oral and salivary cancer, then heck, that was a pretty successful post or page on a website. So obviously we can't follow that all the way through, but you don't need 100,000 people a day to see that particular page in order for it to be successful. And we're going to talk about defining success in a minute. So in this case, a lack of page views or talking about other metrics that are more marketing based, such as pages per session, a lack of pages per session in this case, or a high bounce rate does not mean the content has failed. In the sense that we're talking about a high bounce rate, if I am at this particular page and let's say I got here because I typed in salivary cancer grants in Google because I'm a researcher at a university and I'm specifically focusing on that area. If it led me directly to this page and I read the information and I got to where I needed to be and then I left this page, that is not a bad thing. A high bounce rate does not mean this content has failed. Although we'll talk about what, the whole events structure can throw bounce rate a little bit. I wish you all could see me right now. I'm moving my hands around a lot. I'll try. It doesn't really matter because you can't see me, but I'm being very animated. So now, opposite, conversely, if we're talking about travel.state.gov, the target audience is much larger because a lot of folks have passports. Like certainly we're not talking about the entire population. Many folks don't have passports, but a heck of a lot more, I would wager, a heck of a lot more people have passports and at some point will need to renew them than are looking for grants to study oral and salivary cancer. So the other thing that's interesting about travel.state.gov is it is the authoritative place that one can go to complete this particular task. So State Department issues passports. So if you need to do something, whether renew your passport or apply for a new one or whatever, if you're talking about passports, travel.state.gov is the place you want to go. So what that does, and that's also very unique within the government context, is that if you are the authoritative, or in some cases, the only place that someone can go in order to complete a task or get certain content, it makes things like a lot of pages per session meaningless. Because it's not necessarily that they're reading all kinds of content. It could be that by golly, they have to complete this task and they can't figure out how to do it. And they've gone through a bunch of pages just trying to find out how to complete it. So I just ruined my next slide because I jumped the gun. But anyways, in this case, large amounts of page views, high pages per session, or lots of returning users does not mean this content has been successful. We don't know it just based on these metrics that are the default metrics that are in the web analytics programs, whether it be Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics or Matomo or Fathom, whatever you use. And I know that the terminology changes a little bit, but these sort of like default things on their own do not tell you if you've actually been achieving what you're out to do. So here was my example. Let's say there's 15 pages per session. And on one hand, what the internet will try to tell you if you try to read about this is they'll say, oh, 15 pages per session is fantastic. People are reading lots of content and like, thumbs up, good for you. But my question that I would ask in the government context is, if you're the only place that you can go to achieve that, how do you know that it's not just people can't find what they need and they're looking all over your site, running up pages per session, trying to find it? Because that would be bad. So how do we get around this? How can we change our mindset to stop just thinking about pages per session and bounce rate and page views in a vacuum? Oh yeah, so here's some other examples of metrics that may or may not be good. If you have a high bounce rate, number one, is the page even designed to retain users? Now, if you've attended other trainings that I've done before, you've heard me go on my tirade about the fact that I don't think bounce rate is a site level metric. I think it's pretty useless at a site level. I am a proponent of looking at bounce rate on a page by page basis, because a high bounce rate on a homepage is very different than a high bounce rate on a blog post that you specifically marketed via your social media team and you directed people right to it. Because in a lot of cases, and this isn't true for all of government sites, but there are many government sites where it really doesn't matter if folks read more than one page, because the kind of information that we try to get out to people is not like, we're not producing, in some cases, maybe we're producing magazines, but in most cases, we're not producing a magazine. We don't want people to read through tons of content, always. Sometimes we do. So you need to think about, is the page even designed to retain users on your site? Or is it more of a, I can get my information and go do something? So that's why bounce rate is wishy-washy. Then secondly, are there events that negate the bounce rate? So this is something, and I'm speaking specifically here within the Google Analytics context, but if you create an event, and there are lots of different things that we can create as events, it's basically any user interaction after a page load that you want to track. You can, when you do that, when you code that event, you can specify that it's either a non-interaction event or an interaction event. An example of something you might classify as a non-interaction event is you can record when there's a video play that happens automatically. So by the way, I wouldn't recommend doing this. I personally hate when I go to like news sites and all of a sudden my speakers start spitting out some video that's hidden in the bottom right corner. But for example, if you had an autoplay video, you could have an event that would record, and you would surely not want to call that an interaction event because the user's not actually interacting, it's just happening. But most events that we see, we would classify as interaction events. Now that would be if the user has to click the play button, for example, or other interaction events. And in this case, DAP specifically records a bunch of interaction events. One of them being outbound link clicks, another one being downloads of assets, mail to clicks, telephone clicks. These are all things that the DAP is by default, we put it in our code so that all folks that use DAP are going to get those events, and they are all interaction events. And that means that if someone clicks on an event, or they trigger an event, you negate a bounce. So what that means is, and here's my example, on this NIDCR page, when we're here, I noticed that to click on the funding opportunities themselves, they actually take me out of nidcr.nih.gov. They take me to grants.nih.gov. And so any click on one of these for this page would be considered an outbound link click, and it would trigger an event in the Digital Analytics program Google Analytics account. Now what that does is it would make it negate a bounce. So if I got here because I typed something in Google, it brought me directly here, and I said, oh, I'm interested in this particular grant. When I clicked here, it would trigger an event, and then we would not have a bounce. So that's something you need to keep in mind thinking about bounce rate. Okay, so here's an example, another example, lots of returning users. Well, is your site even designed to have people return? You know, it's like, if you think about it, there are many government sites where probably you don't necessarily need people to return. One example I can think of off the top of my head is like, you know, we're in sort of election season, we got primaries, vote.gov. So if you go to vote.gov, one of the primary purpose of vote.gov is to direct you to your state's site or place where you can register to vote in that particular state. So vote.gov is a federal government site that is designed to bring you to your state's registration. If everything goes right, why would you go back to vote.gov? There's no reason for you to go back. Ideally, I go there once, I use the drop down, I pick my state, I go where I have to go at my state to register, and I register, and it's all done. So I would never return to vote.gov. So in that case, why would returning users be something that I would care about? Just something to think about when you're thinking about the purpose of your particular site. And then long session duration. Well, that's a question of how long do you really want your users to stay? Now, if you go and you look these things up and you try to find information online, almost everything will tell you long session duration is good. But again, when we're in the area here where in government, people might not have options, the long session duration, similar to pages per session, might just mean they can't find what they're looking for. We just don't know in a vacuum. So I'm not saying all this to insinuate that these metrics are meaningless. They are not. They are valuable metrics, but they're best used in the context of your specific site goals. And this is this is the mindset I'm talking about. Moving into understanding actions that you want your users to take, and even if that action just might be reading the content, rather than relying on, we have 10 million page views. 10 million page views doesn't tell you anything. So how do we best determine success for our sites? And that's where we talk about considering metrics for measuring success in the public sector. So here is a screenshot from Google. I went to Google and I typed in content site success metrics, right? And this is from the first page of results. I think it's about midway down the page. I'll say that I don't think I captured the screen from the top, but this is all first page results. Now, take a look at it. And I want you to not tell me, but think in your head, what are some things that are standing out to you here? I'll give you a second. Okay, so here's what I saw. How to measure your content marketing. 5 critical metrics to measure content marketing performance. How to measure content marketing success. 5 key metrics for content marketing success. All of these things, look, notice I wrote content site success metrics. Every result on this particular screenshot is not telling me about how to measure success on my site. It's telling me how to measure if I'm successful in getting people to my site, which we've already determined is not the right thing to be measuring. So, and it's further emphasized when you look deeper into the descriptions. Website traffic is the foundation of content marketing success. Page views are a great metric to gauge which piece of your content, blah, 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 blah. If your main goal is driving traffic to your site, then you want to keep a close eye on traffic metrics. This is junk. It's not, we shouldn't be only thinking about how to get people to our sites. And again, my next slide is going to say here, I'm not trying to diss content marketing. Getting people to your site, of course, is important. But it is not the only important thing. And it also, content marketing is not about getting tons of people to your site or page. It's about getting the right people to your site or page. So if I end up on a government website when I'm doing a Google search for John Deere zero-turn lawnmowers, well, that was a waste. Sure, it'll look like a page view. I mean, I don't know how that would happen, but theoretically, if I was looking for lawnmowers and I ended up on, unless it's a recall, I suppose, but if I was looking for lawnmowers and I ended up on a government website, well, sure, that's a page view, but what a waste of a user. I'm not going to do anything on that page. I'm not going to read any content. So yeah, you could try to do marketing to just bring tons of people to your site, but there's no purpose in it. What you want to do is get the correct people, the people, your target audience to your site. And that requires more work. Then obviously the main focus of this particular webinar is once you get those people to your site, it matters if they read it and or take a correlated action that you can measure. Now, I know there are plenty of sites out there that are probably only content and all you have to go on is trying to measure whether or not someone read the content. That's a little more difficult. We're going to talk about how to do it in a bit. But if you have a correlated action that you can measure, and that could look like an external link click. So for the example of my of oral and salivary cancer grants on NIDCR, obviously clicking on those those grant opportunities would constitute an action that you want your user to take. So you can measure those. I talked about video plays, and also if you're tracking video plays, you probably want to know how long they're watching. Resource downloads. So this is what I'm going to talk about in a moment with the travel.state.gov example. This is the place you can go to get your DS-82, which is how you actually apply for the renewal of your passport. And there's 2 different ways you can do it. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So you could measure, well, are people engaged with the content? Are they downloading the things we want them to download in order to, get to the next level of our service? Things like newsletter signups you can measure, and you could also measure contact clicks. I personally am not a huge fan of trying to put a lot of stock in contact clicks, and that's because firstly, I almost never click on an email address on a web page because it opens the default client in my laptop, which I don't use. And I know that I can adjust my settings to change that, but I'm lazy and I haven't. So I very, very rarely actually click on an email address. I usually copy it and put it into Gmail or my work email, whatever. And also you can measure phone clicks. We do. DAP does this for you. We measure email and phone clicks. Phone clicks are great to measure, but obviously the caveat there is that it only works when you're on a phone, because phone browsers identify what phone numbers look like, and you can click on it and then it will automatically call that number. So you have to just adjust your thinking in that sense, that no one's clicking on a phone number when they're on a desktop. Just food for thought. And form fills or application submits. So that's a big one. If you have some sort of form, online form or application that's online, and you're not measuring how many, like for example, the funnel of where folks are getting from step 1 to step 5 and how many folks complete that funnel, you should be. Okay, so practical measures for real impact on government sites. So what can we actually do? Well, across all sites, one thing you can do is ensure that your site is findable. And you want to use Search Console to do that, mainly because Search Console measures traffic coming from google.com, and google.com is by far and away the most popular browser at this time and has been for years. So if there's a time where another browser overtakes Google as the most popular browser, Search Console will be less helpful. But right now, it's just helpful because most of the traffic comes from Google if it's coming from organic search. So if you don't already use Search Console, you should be. It tells you the keywords that people are putting in and which of your pages appear in search results pages, how often they appear, what rank they appeared in, how often they were clicked on. You can do a whole bunch of stuff in this tool in order to improve your SEO. I have found that it's really a toss-up on whether teams use it or not. There's a whole bunch of teams that don't use it. And if you don't, I really recommend that you do. We could have a whole separate webinar on Search Console. We have actually had a separate webinar on Search Console. So I'm not going to talk about it too much more, but know that it's important, because when I was talking about that content marketing aspect, getting people to your site when they put in the right keywords, that is important to get that target audience there. Now, this is an interesting one. One thing you can do is you could get a sense of the proper time on page, particularly on your content pages. Like, I wouldn't necessarily do this on a home page, but you can get an understanding of how much time it might take an average adult to read the content on that page. And I found some source here. I looked around. Some places say the average adult reads about 200 words per minute. Some say 300 words per minute. This particular one says 250, so I took the middle. But if you know, for example, that you have a 500-word post, then theoretically it would take approximately 2 minutes for a person to read it all. And you could actually, I was thinking about this and I thought, you could even make it a custom dimension in Google Analytics. You could have a word count be pushed into Google Analytics. And I searched for it and I actually found a blog post that talks about how to do it. So this would not be something that, that at this moment we do or can do in the DAP account, but you could do it in your own independent Google Analytics accounts. So that's a kind of interesting thought. But beyond that, I think you could even go further. Word count is one thing. I think you could actually write a little piece of code that would do some math for you and would take the total word count on the page and divide it by 250 to get you an approximate amount of minutes that it might take, and then push that into Google Analytics. And you could then run reports where when you have a page, you could use the average time on page metric that comes default in Google Analytics. And you could also run in a flat table custom report, you could add in the dimension for estimated time to read, for example. And you might get an idea of how long people are spending on that page versus how long it should approximately take them to read it. That got us thinking even more. So I was talking about this with Freddie, and Freddie said, hey, maybe this is something that we could do in the DAP account. So that was literally like this morning. So I'm not making any promises, but I think we're going to look into our options. And if that's something that you feel like would benefit you if we put it in the DAP account in a future code release, please let us know. It might be possible. So we're going to examine it. But That's about all you can do across any site. Make sure it's findable. You could do this time on page thing. When we're talking about site-specific stuff, this is where we want to identify specific KPIs and those conversions. And then we want to measure conversion rates rather than just talking about page views and time on page. Also, use those KPIs to measure which of your acquisition channels convert the most. So this is combining the content marketing aspect, the sort of first half of our experience, with the second half of how often do those people convert. So you might be able to find out that your social, posts on social media create a 10% conversion rate for a specific KPI, whereas an email that you send out to a listserv might create a 15% conversion on that KPI. So knowing those acquisition channels helps you devote resources to the ones that are going to succeed. And then when you understand that, you can start playing with things to see how you can change that conversion rate. So if social media was 10%, email was 15%, you could start adjusting the times that you made those posts on social media and measure which ones were converting more, and so on. So lots of things we can do here. Now, when we're talking about those specific KPIs, I kind of, I gave you a little glimpse as to something that we could track for each of these sites. For NIDCR, obviously for this particular page, something that would be beneficial to track is understanding probably not only how many times you got an outbound link click, but also which ones were most popular, because then these are obviously the ones that were clicked on the most are the grants that have the most demand. So that would be interesting. Also though, you could probably do something that was a little more broad. So a large portion of this site is grants and funding. It's not all, just these ones, I don't think. Let me click here. Yeah, there's tons of grant programs. I just clicked on one. So each of these grant programs has a page, just like oral and salivary cancer biology, where they have a bunch of grants that are offered. So you could really do something at a site level where the KPI could be outbound link clicks to grants.nih.gov over total sessions. So what this would mean is, and I'll set this up here, you would measure how many times per visit, session and visit are interchangeable, how many times per visit did someone click on a grants.nih.gov link? And that would include any of those grant opportunities across all of those particular topics, right? And you might find that it's, let's say, 0.2. 0.2 would mean 1 out of every 5 sessions someone comes to your site, they click on one of those links. And then that's when you have something to go off of. Then you can say, okay, well, is one of our goals to try to increase the amount of folks that are checking out these grant opportunities? If it is, then you've got your 0.2 baseline, and you can start making A/B tests, preferably, or just you could change the content and then measure it again. But ideally, you have an A/B testing tool. I know that most of us don't, but try to get one. But you could run A/B tests to say, like, okay, what could we change to try to increase that particular ratio? It might be you put on the homepage, you put a big link to grant opportunities. It might be that you move the grant opportunity links up on the pages or something. You make user experience changes that are designed to help your users accomplish the goals for this site, not try to get a bunch of people to the site and call it a win, because it's not a win unless they actually do what you want them to do. So you could create a custom report that would show you the number of outbound clicks matching grants.nih.gov, and you could segment that by acquisition channel, so you could figure out how your marketing outreach actually converts into, not converts, but how it translates into conversions. So for travel.state.gov, again, I picked something here that I think I'm relatively sure one of the big aspects of travel.state.gov is this passport renewal. So when we're talking about goals for not only this page, but probably most of the site. One of the things that I think they're probably very interested in is how many folks are downloading the DS82. And you notice here they have two different methods of doing it. You can download the PDF, or there's a different site that you can go to where it has a fillable form online. And that brings you to pptform.state.gov. So the great thing is that DAP already measures both of these things for you, because we measure PDF downloads and we measure outbound link clicks. So for this particular page, you can get a very good idea, not only of how many folks were actually downloading the form in some way, but also which one is more popular. You could find out if more folks are filling out the form online versus downloading the PDF. And if you find out that, for example, everyone wants to fill it out online, that could be something that you could use for decision-making and resources to potentially, let's say, put the whole thing online. Maybe instead of filling out the form online, you make actually, an entire application process online. I think actually travel.state.gov is working on that, but that's just an example. So again here, the possible KPI could be DS82 downloads over total page views. And you could do this depending on, I'm not on this team, so I don't know if it's necessarily a goal that should be used for the entire site, or if it's a goal that maybe is more specific to a group of pages. But you could say, every time this particular renewal page was downloaded, I want to know what the percentage of folks that either make a download, or even you could do downloads and outbound links and combine them. And your metric would be clicking on one of those two options over page views. And you could create a report to show you the total number of downloads compared to page views. And then you could segment by acquisition channel or device or browser. So this is where you start breaking things down to figure out what you can change. So you might find that on desktops, you get 80% of all clicks to the DS82 are for that online form fill. But on phones, people don't want to deal with that, so maybe it reverses and 60% on phones are the normal PDF form. Okay, well that's information you can work with. You can actually use that to create tests to make things easier for your users to accomplish your goal. And that's the whole reason we have analytics, folks. It's like, a lot of folks think that web analytics is strictly e-commerce. Well, if it were just e-commerce, then we wouldn't need analytics in government. But it's worthwhile for user research, for user experience, to be able to have this data combined with other tools, combined with A/B testing, combined with heat mapping, combined with qualitative surveys, combined with user research in the sense of usability tests. Lots of different things that all play into making this the most efficient thing you can for your target audience. So I noted you can already do these things in the DAP account. Now, the one thing that you can't do in the DAP account is, because of our structure with so many websites, we don't have the ability, or haven't figured out a way that would make it equitable to use the goals section. If you are familiar with Google Analytics beyond a sort of a novice level, you'll know that there's a section where you can actually set goals. And then Google Analytics will calculate these conversions for you. So if you're using the DAP account, you have to do a report. You might have to export it and have a spreadsheet where it does some math for you. But if you're using your independent account, you could actually set all this up, and then you could have it, for example, an outbound link for the NIDCR example. You could create a goal that says trigger a conversion every time an outbound link to grants.nih.gov happens from this site. And then Google Analytics does a bunch of math for you, gets you the conversions, and allows you to segment by those acquisition channels, and it will give you all the data you need to tell you which ones are performing best. So the DAP account has the advantage of having these events already being recorded, whereas a default Google Analytics account or a free Google Analytics account will not have these events already recorded. You'd have to configure them. But the downside is the DAP account doesn't allow you to set up goals currently, whereas your independent one does. So again, things to consider. Now, this is an interesting one. I did want to mention this. If your site is strictly a content site, so you don't have those outbound links to measure, you don't have a download to measure to know if your users are engaged, there is an event called scroll depth tracking. And scroll depth tracking is most easily implemented with Google Tag Manager. So I'm going to show you these links here. There's a scroll depth trigger in Google Tag Manager that's now set up by default. And you can basically, in Tag Manager, with a couple clicks, set up something where it will tell you how far down a user scrolled on the page. Now, does that mean that they absolutely 100% read the information on the page? No. But it gives you a little bit of a better idea of what people are doing rather than just they saw the page, but you don't know how far they scrolled. So this is an option. This is a picture from this blog post from Simo Ahava, who's like the tag manager guru. And this is a blog post here that tells you how to enable the scroll depth tracker. And what's pretty interesting about it is that you can set the percentages that you want the event to fire. So as you can see in the example here, Simo has it set up so that there are 4 thresholds. When someone gets to 25%, 50%, 75%, 100% of the page, it will fire an event. So you can then know, if you're looking at your particular, for any given page, you can look at the events that were fired and understand how many folks are getting to the end of it. Couple things about this. Number 1, be aware it will create a lot of events. So I wouldn't run it on every page. I would run it specifically on pages that are that content that you want to try to track people reading, not just any navigation page. As people scroll, it's going to send a new event every time they cross a threshold. So in this case, with the 4, if I scrolled the entire page, every single person who scrolled the entire page would create 4 events. Now, you're asking me, why does it matter if there are a ton of events? Well, if you use a free Google Analytics account, there is what we call the hit cliff. So the reason that it's free is that they limit your traffic to 10 million hits per month. And if you go over that, they can turn it off on you. And when I'm talking about hits in the Google Analytics sense, it means anytime the code is being called. So that is every page view plus every event. So if someone were to land on a page and scroll down to the bottom with this particular setup on a quarter percentage event basis, that would be 5 hits because the page view load would be 1 and every event that fired would be another 1. So you'd have 5 hits of your 10 million on a single page load with a scroll. That is also why we ask that you do not implement this and push the event to the Digital Analytics Program account. Because if you're running a free account, you have to worry about hitting the hit cliff. But if you're running a paid account, you have to be worried about encountering more money. Because the way that we pay for DAP is on a tiered basis. So for every billion hit threshold we cross, we have to pay extra money. And if I find that there are a gajillion events coming from some site because they implemented scroll depth tracking, I'm going to come knocking at your door and ask you to turn that off because we're paying for it. So this would be something that I would definitely recommend you do in your independent accounts. But again, you can set triggers. So you can set a trigger on it so that you see at the bottom of this particular screenshot where it says this trigger fires on. It's got all pages or some pages. You could, for example, click some pages and then you could say fire only on pages that contain /blog. And if you have your site set up with a good information architecture where you have a directory for the blogs, and those are the ones that you care about measuring scroll depth, easy enough to do with Tag Manager. If you try to do it without Tag Manager, it's a bit more work. You have to put code into your HTML. It would be something that you'd have to work with developers on doing. But with tag managers, this becomes much, much easier. So this is an option. Don't do this and push it to the DAP account, please. But feel free to do it on your independent account as long as you feel like it's not going to create too many hits for you. Okay, 2:46, not bad. We got some time for questions. Let's talk about the takeaways. Number one, page views alone does not equal success, nor does pages per session, nor does returning users, nor does a super low bounce rate. Doesn't matter. Those things, those metrics on their own, not telling you whether or not you actually got your users to do what you hope they do. Defining success is not easy or universal. So as you saw on my slide, there were only really 2 things that I could tell you were applicable for all sites. Make it findable, and you could do that word count thing, I guess, on all sites. I mean, that's not even something that's honestly particularly tested, tried and true. It's just an idea. So the hard part that you all have to do is to think about what are these actions that you can track that actually tell you if a user is doing what you want them to do. How can you measure that KPI? Create a system in which you're reporting on conversions rather than page views, and then put in place a process where you can do tests to actually improve those metrics. That's asking a lot. It's not, you can't just implement Google Analytics and then think, okay, we're going to be able to figure out if our site does what we want. It doesn't happen. You're going to have to do work out of GA. You're going to have to do a lot of strategy. And another thing that I didn't even mention is a lot of times this takes a little bit of work to sell your leadership. I usually offer, you know, if for some reason you have leadership that doesn't want to accept that this is the real way to do measurement, I mean, you could set up a meeting with us and I'm happy to try to give this presentation, or you could send them this presentation and see if it convinces them. Obviously, we all work in different environments, but it's not easy to figure out whether or not you're actually achieving what you want to do. But when you do figure out if you're actually achieving what you want to do, you can make changes that are really rewarding and help your target audience complete tasks or read content, whatever it is. Custom KPIs are necessary to gauge real progress. We talked about those, various different things that you can look at. And this is my other soapbox. None of this is worthwhile without the ability to change content or outreach in order to improve. So if you do all this strategy work and figure out what your KPIs are, and you get in spreadsheets and you get conversion rates, or you set up goals in your independent account and get these conversion rates and you report them, but there's no structure in place for you to actually make any changes, it was all for naught. Because all the data in the world is not going to help you improve things for your users unless you have the ability to actually improve things for your users. So as much as it is important to have the correct strategy on this, it's also important to be able to pull the right strings, to change outreach, test things in your outreach, change your content, test things in your content. I know that's easier said than done, but it's true. Okay, I am confident that you've all got this. I hope that this chat has inspired you to go define these KPIs if you haven't already. And for those of you that have, bravo. I am confident that in government, we can get to a place where everyone is looking at these metrics rather than the metrics that aren't really telling you much. Okay, with that, I am happy to take questions. And if you have something that you don't want to ask in the chat, you can reach out to us at dap@support.digitalgov.gov, and we'll do our best to answer. But right now we've got 10 minutes. Freddie, are there any questions?
Yes, we have some lively discussion going on in the chat room, and we do have some questions. So let me jump into those.
Great.
We had one question about defining an intended conversion and then measuring that is the most important. You have any thoughts on that, Tim?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question.
Yeah, I believe it was referring to one of your original slides in the beginning, but my takeaway from this is that, you know, obviously understanding how you're defining conversion is important, along with how you're analyzing your content. So I think, you know, both are important. The next question here is, my agency recently moved from Google to Microsoft for email and cloud documents. This person used to be able to use their .gov address to access Google Analytics and see DAP data. How can they now access that data now that they no longer have a .gov account I believe, registered with Google.
Yeah. Okay. I know that agency. We've been working with that agency. It's caused a problem for a lot of folks in terms of getting onto Google Analytics. There's a couple different options we can take, but I would encourage that person to reach out to us at dap@support.digitalgov.gov, and we will work with them to help them get access. We are told that for that agency, after a certain amount of time passes, their email address will be able to be re-affiliated to be able to access Google Analytics. But until then, we have to figure out workarounds. So email us and we'll work with you.
Great. Next question is there any way to track how long someone is on a PDF or some other type of asset, or can you only get information on the click or download of that PDF?
Great question. In terms of Google Analytics, the way Google Analytics works is it's JavaScript that fires from within the HTML of the page. And the only way, also, I didn't even touch on the fact that when we're talking about how Google Analytics measures time, it doesn't do it in a way that has a running clock, and then when you leave the page, it records it. The way that Google Analytics measures time on page is only if you click to another page. So there's a timestamp that happens when the JavaScript fires. So if I open page A, it sends a call to Google Analytics and a bunch of data is recorded, and one of them is the time. When I go to page B, it then sends another call where I get a timestamp. And what Google Analytics does is it literally subtracts time A from time B to figure out how long you were on page A. So that means if you, number one, if you don't go to page B, if you're only on page A and then you leave, there is no time recorded for that visit. That's a whole separate thing. Let me get back to your question. Because PDFs and other assets, .docs or .xls or any of those things, because they don't actually have a place where you could put a Google Analytics script tag in HTML, we can't measure anything on them. We can't, in fact, if you link directly to a PDF, if you're, like, let's say your website, or your server hosts a PDF, but you in your email link directly to it, Google Analytics is not going to record that. What Google Analytics does in our particular case for DAP, we have an auto tracker that when the page loads, it scans the page for all of the links that end in .pdf or .xls or whatever, and then listens for when they're clicked. So all it can do is give us the click. Can't tell you how much time somebody spent on a PDF. Can't tell you if they got through 3 pages of a PDF and then closed it because it got too frustrating. Unfortunately, as far as web analytics goes, only going to tell you what's on the actual website.
Great. Next question is, how are you distinguishing between mobile traffic visitor behaviors from desktop traffic visitor behaviors as they relate to this topic?
So the best way to distinguish that would be to use segmentation, if we're talking with Google Analytics. So you can create a segment that just specifies mobile versus desktop, or mobile and tablet versus desktop. And you can either, if you're using the DAP report, you can draw reports that are specific to those devices and then figure out your conversion rates. Or if you are working in your independent account, you can set up goals, and then you can actually just segment and it'll just show you the conversion rates right in the GA interface. But definitely the way that I would do that is via applying segments to the reports.
Great. Next question is actually not a question, but we do have a couple votes for including word count in DAP as a custom dimension. So that's interesting to hear. Thanks for everyone's feedback. Next question is, somebody has mentioned that they used 4C survey results, but they stopped using it because the response rates were too low. They'd still like a way to measure if visitors are having a successful or satisfactory visit. Are there any suggestions for any other survey tools that measure this type of behavior and user satisfaction? Looks like one person mentioned Qualtrics. Tim, do you have any other thoughts on any others? I can't think of any other ones other than 4C and Qualtrics.
I think there's probably a bunch of tools out there. It might even be something that Hotjar can do. I'm not positive, but Qualtrics is certainly one that's used a lot. 4C is used a lot. There's an internal to government program that is in the infancy of trying to do this. It's called the Feedback Analytics Program. It's also based here at GSA, and they are trying to create sort of simple surveys that could be implemented on government websites. So there's a bunch of different ways to do it, but I just want to say that I applaud your decision not to use survey data that is not statistically significant. Just because you get 5 responses out of 1,000 visits or something like that does not mean that those 5 responses are indicative of a trend of user sentiment. So I think it was the right call if you weren't getting a statistically significant response rate. I think ideally you would try to adjust the settings of your survey to get a higher response rate, but if that wasn't happening, good call not to use that data.
Great. Those are all of our questions.
Fantastic. Wow, good timing, folks. I really enjoyed delivering this webinar. It is a topic that, if you couldn't tell, I get pretty enthused about. So for those of you who either had questions that didn't get answered, or if you want to ask us questions offline or off of this call, I guess, please email us, dap@support.digitalgov.gov. We had over 100 participants today, so many thanks to those of you who came out to watch. And keep an eye out for the follow-ups that I promised in the beginning of the webinar. We hope you enjoy the rest of your week and have a great weekend. And we'll see you next month for our next session.